For more on the foreign policy challenges facing President Obama, I sat down exclusively with former British Prime Minister Tony Blair. He issued an urgent warning about why the U.S. needs to extinguish Islamic extremism. But first, I asked him about this ongoing crisis in Ukraine.
So, again, you've looked into Putin's eyes, as did President Bush. He's already taken Crimea. He must sense enough weakness that he's not backing down. He's not following through on this truce of a kind. What do you think his end game in all this is?
I think that's hard to judge. I mean, I think what you can say is that the idea that he has is of a resurgent Russia, that obviously linking up with Russian-speaking people in the vicinity of Russia. I think it's hard to know what the end game is, but I'm absolutely sure that we're right to take a strong approach and to lay down some very clear messages and be prepared to back that up with action if necessary. Now, I hope that, as I say, I hope that this can be resolved in a way that is peaceful, because that's massively in the interest of everybody. Because otherwise, you'll be back into a situation where the relationship between Russia and Europe and Russia and the West becomes very difficult.
You're talking this week, and you've made some provocative comments about the state of the Middle East and radical Islam. And I'm going to show a portion of your speech that you gave this week, in which you said the threat of this radical Islam is not abating. It is growing. It's spreading across the world. It is destabilizing communities and even nations. And in the face of this threat, we seem curiously reluctant to acknowledge it and powerless to counter it effectively. Why is this happening, and who specifically do you blame for it happening?
I don't think it's a question of blaming anyone, but I think we've got to understand the nature of what is happening with this Islamist ideology. I mean, the reason, and I say this with a certain amount of humility, I went through the post-9/11 world, Afghanistan, Iraq, trying to deal with these issues. I think what is absolutely clear in the Middle East and beyond is that the single most important thing to understand about the different countries with their different conflicts and challenges is that the common theme is the disruptive effect of an ideology based on an extreme, in my view, perverted view of the proper faith of Islam. This Islamist ideology, which has been exported from the Middle East, I'm afraid is growing. It's not abating.
But is that in part because this administration has taken its foot off the gas pedal? I mean, look, there was a presidential campaign and an effort by this president to leave these wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and to get out of the business of trying to change the Middle East.
Sure. So
was that part of the problem? Was it why it's not abating?
No. What have we learned from this experience then? Both the experience of intervention through Afghanistan and Iraq, and then the experience of the last few years. What we've learned is that both are very difficult, right? We know to our own cost how difficult it's been in the engagements in Iraq and Afghanistan. But we also know, when we look at Syria today, which is a country in disintegration, probably well over 150,000 people dying now and no end in sight. Or if we look at Libya, where we did intervene through air power alone, changed the government, but it's now a mess that is exporting its problems across the Middle East. So the issue, what we've got to understand, rather than saying, who's to blame for this, is to say, what is the nature of this threat and how do we counter it?
No, but what you're saying is that you have to call it what it is, and you can't be reluctant to act. And on this program last week, David Brooks, a columnist for the New York Times, said the following about President Obama. He said, let's face it, Obama, whether deservedly or not, does have, I'll say it crudely, this is him speaking, but a manhood problem in the Middle East. Is he tough enough to stand up to somebody like Assad, somebody like Putin? I think a lot of the rap is unfair, but certainly in the Middle East there's an assumption that he is not tough. You mentioned Syria. President drew a red line. Chemical weapons were used. He did not follow through. You have sectarian violence. You have what could be the verge of a failed state in Syria.
Right, but the question is, what do you now do about this? I mean, we can debate how we got here, and as you rightly pointed out earlier, there's a huge reaction, not just in America, by the way, but in the UK and over our side of the water as well, against the concept of intervention. What I'm really saying is, look, if we analyze correctly what the nature of the problem is, in each of these individual countries, there are things that we're going to have to do that require commitment and engagement. It doesn't mean doing what we did in Iraq or Afghanistan, but it does mean being prepared to engage, and engage specifically knowing and identifying that the problem is around this Islamist ideology. And so whether it's, for example, in Egypt, or whether it would be in Yemen or Syria.
Isn't the legacy of your leadership and that of President Bush in part responsible for the reality today? To wit, I mean this. I have spoken to writers, other journalists, leaders. Former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates writes in his memoir, Afghanistan was the proving ground for Islamic fundamentalism in the Muslim world. And by invading Iraq, there was necessarily a transfer of tremendous resources to fight the war in Iraq. And today, the Taliban is resurgent and still very powerful in Pakistan, and could be once again in Afghanistan. So part one to that.
Right.
Did President Bush, did the West fail to deal with the extremism you talk about today appropriately in Afghanistan in a sustainable way?
I think we did, but I think we've got to recognize one thing very, very clearly. This is a long battle. Right. The best way to look at this is to take an analogy probably with something like revolutionary communism or even fascism. In other words, this ideology is not going to be defeated by an engagement in Afghanistan, in Iraq, or even in these individual arenas. It's going to be defeated over a long period of time.
Right, but it's very difficult. I mean, you're a former politician. In order to keep free societies engaged in the kind of engagement that you say is necessary for a long, sustained period of time, and then you have to ultimately look at results, right? So the question about Iraq. Dame Eliza Manningham-Buehler, of course, former head of MI5 in Great Britain, domestic service there. She said this back in 2011 about the invasion of Iraq and the impact. In my view, she says, whatever the merits of putting an end to Saddam Hussein, the war was also a distraction from the pursuit of al-Qaeda. It increased the terrorist threat by convincing more people that Osama bin Laden's claim that Islam was under attack was correct. It provided an arena for the jihad for which he had called, so that many of his supporters, including British citizens, traveled to Iraq to attack Western forces. It also showed very clearly that foreign and domestic policy are intertwined. Actions overseas have an impact at home, which is to say that radicalization there will also come home to roost and affect Great Britain and could indeed affect America.
So we've got to liberate ourselves from this, because we're making a huge error when we end up thinking somehow it's our actions that have caused this. Let's be very clear in Afghanistan and Iraq. You can agree or disagree with either decision. We removed brutal dictatorships, allowed the people a chance to elect their government. They came out in both cases and voted, showing that they wanted such election. We gave them a massive amount of financial support. What was the disruptive effect? The disruptive effect was that very Islamist ideology I'm talking about, on the one side being pushed out of Iran from the Iranian theocracy, on the other side Al-Qaeda and other groups, and they combined to try and destabilize the wishes of the majority of the country. Now, when we weren't involved, as in Syria, they're still going and fighting jihad there. So you can carry on explaining all this by saying it's us, we provoked them, you know, it's really, they're just trying to react against Western imperialism. It's nonsense. If it were the case, for example, that the reason why they were engaged in this terrorism in Iraq was because of the presence of American troops or British troops, you would expect when we'd get out, the terrorism would stop. It doesn't. And it doesn't because it's not coming from us. Right. It's coming from this ideology, and we aren't going to defeat it until we liberate ourselves from the attitude that somehow we're the cause of it.
The obvious conclusion to me from what you're saying is this administration, this president is making a mistake by disengaging from Iraq, by disengaging militarily from Afghanistan, and by having a view, as he has said publicly, that the United States should only intervene where it truly believes it can make a difference. I hear you saying no. If you want to tackle radical Islam, if you want to prevent the occurrence of failed states, America specifically must project its power in these places because the struggle is so long.
No. I'm not criticizing President Obama at all over this, because, as I say, I went through these types of decisions. I know how difficult it is. And what he would quite rightly point to, which you indicated, David, earlier, is, you know, our public opinion has been through, it's got fatigued with engagement. What I'm saying is this, the engagement that we enter into doesn't have to be like Iraq or Afghanistan.
Could the world more effectively deal with radical Islam had the invasion of Iraq not occurred?
No, because the fact is, you know, radical Islam was responsible for 9/11. Before Afghanistan, before Iraq. This has been a long time.
That wasn't
gestation.
Saddam Hussein.
No, it wasn't Saddam Hussein, but the fact is that the existence of this ideology, it didn't start post 9/11. It didn't start post Afghanistan or Iraq. You know, again, this is where we've got to be realistic about this. This has grown up over a long period of time. It's come out of the Middle East. It's been taught in informal and formal education systems. And the thing that I'm saying is, look, climate change is a big issue. The running of the global economy is a big issue. But so is educating our young people to an open-minded attitude and mindset for the world.
The Middle East peace process, is it about to crumble? And what's your angle on this? What would you do to somehow revive it?
Keep going. You can never give up with these things. Look, I remember...
Even if it looks like it's going nowhere.
Yeah, look, if I'd given up when the Northern Ireland peace process looked as if it was going nowhere, we would never have got there. And the fact is, in the end, in the Middle East, what do people know? They know there is only one solution, which is two states living side by side, and actually a majority of people support it. Now, the politics of both sides make it tough right now, but I think John Kerry's shown, you know, really great leadership and commitment in pushing this and driving it, and I think he's got to keep going with it. And however difficult it is, and you know, the last few days have been difficult, my strong advice would be, you know, we know what the right thing to do is here, let's just keep doing it.